I'm going to have a piece up on TexasFootball.com about how first-year Texas high school football coaches fared in 2020. And we've talked with a lot of coaches about the struggles of coaching in 2020. And I think one thing that we thought was just kind of, I don't want to say a given, but one thing that I think we thought was an assumption was, boy, this is not the year to be making a coaching change.
Yeah.
This is not the year. You want to have stability. You want to have guys who are like they're used to the voice in the room, things like that, right? And I think that kind of bears out when you take a look at, like, say the state championship games, right? That you look at we did not have for the first time in a minute. We did not have like a first-year coach take a team to a state championship game. It was all guys who have been there before.
Yes.
Okay. And I think that kind of in our mind checks out. That goes, oh yeah, you do not want to be taking over, when in a time when you can't get together with your guys, when you can't have a normal offseason. I think that was what was so remarkable and why we went to talk with Dowaski Davis yesterday of Liberty ILO, that here's a guy who took over in June and still was able to improve his team by 6 wins. And in fact, if you take a look at the numbers, the teams that were the most improved, it's kind of hard to a quick preface. Normally, what I would say is who had the most number of wins increase this year versus last year. But with the pandemic and with a lot of games being canceled and shortened seasons and things like that, that's not necessarily a real apples to apples comparison. So instead, we're going to kind of take a look at both winning percentage and number of wins.
Okay.
Increased, right? Because we want to have that kind of balance.
Right. Because
there were teams that only played 5 games, right? There were only teams that, like, for example, there was a team, for example, I believe it was El Paso Chapin. El Paso Chapin, had a nice year and increased, they had a better year, but part of it is that they won the same number of games, they just played fewer games, right? That's one thing to keep an eye on. So I wanted to look at this. And on the whole, overall, last year, there were 161 UIL 11-man coaching changes. 161.
Okay.
Now, that is below average, and I think that's not.
There's probably a reason for that.
That is below average, especially for a realignment year.
Yes.
Realignment tends to light a fire under coaches to move, and there tends to be a little bit more of movement in realignment years. And if you remember, last year was a realignment year. 161 coaching changes is not necessarily that's below average, especially for a realignment year. On the whole, the winning percentage for these teams did drop, but less than you think. They dropped by a grand total of 0.04 in the winning percentage.
So pretty minuscule.
So if you had a 5, if every team was 529 in 2020, then these teams finished with an average winning percentage of 460. Okay. So now that's averaging. There were teams that were much better. Right? We mentioned Dowaski Davis at Liberty ILO. They won 6 more games than they did the year before. Right? Lovejoy under first-year coach Chris Ross won 6 more games than they did the year before.
Lovejoy popped off.
Yeah. Bay City under new coach Robert Jones. Callisburg under new coach Eddie Gill. Little River Academy under new coach Chris Lancaster. Sunray under new coach Wes Boatman. Tenaha under new coach Jeremy Jenkins. And Franklin under new coach Mark Fannin all won 5 more games than they did the year before, right? So on balance, there were teams that were able to kind of overcome that.
Right.
Furthermore, there were other teams like, and here's a perfect example of a team that maybe you got to take it with a grain of salt. San Antonio Highlands. Chris Castillo took over a team that was 1-9 the year before, and they went 4-2. Okay, they went 4-2. They were, from a winning percentage perspective, the biggest riser this year in 2021.
Right. But they only played 6 games.
But they only won 3 more games than they did the year before. So there's that. I would say that, again, you guys like Robert Jones, who took over an 0-9 Bay City team and took them to a 5-5 year, that's pretty remarkable, right? So overall, one thing as I was diving into these numbers that I thought was interesting is our preconceived notion of, boy, you just don't want to take over a program. You just don't want to be having to hit the reset button as right now. I think that's a little bit overblown. I think we probably overcooked that a little bit. That it was okay. I don't think it was necessarily preferable.
It wasn't ideally what they would want.
Ideal,
but
I do think that overall, coaches did see a first-year dip, but not necessarily this huge fall off a cliff thing where, oh my gosh, like it was massive. I would bet, and I would need to dig into the numbers, and I want to do this on a yearly basis and compare and contrast. I would bet that next year we see similar numbers.
Yeah.
I think that overall, on balance, in a normal year, first-year coaches tend to struggle. Tend to maybe you take a step back. There are some situations where, like, for example, there are other situations where it's like, I'll take an example of a Mount Enterprise. Okay, Mount Enterprise coach Gabe North took over for Jeremy Jenkins and went to Town Hall. He took over a team that was 10-2. Okay, now they had a disappointing year. Right? I don't think there's really getting away from that. That Mount Enterprise had a disappointing year, going 1-9. But the bar was also set so high there was kind of nowhere to go.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and the one that always comes to my mind is Trey Brooks taking over at Rockwall. Obviously took over, he was the offensive coordinator, took over for Rodney Webb. But when I had talked to him once this season when I covered a game, and what he told me and this was his first ever head coaching job, so that kind of adds another layer to it. But what he had told me is he's like, I never dreamt of my introductory, school board meeting being over Zoom. And he was like, we got our neighbors to take pictures of us, of my family, to prove like, hey, we actually did this. But he also said he was almost a little bit grateful for it, because you go into this situation as a first-time head coach and have no, he goes, it opened my mind that there are other ways to do things, that you can learn to live and adapt. And if I can make it through this first year, hopefully after that I'll be good.
Well, and there were also coaches here who they saw their teams take a step back in their first year that, like, I don't worry about, because I know they're good coaches. Okay? Let's put it this way. New Caney. Brady Pennington left after a 10-1 season. They hired Travis Reeve, who had just got done leading Cuero to a state championship in 2018, right? Travis Reeve's a good coach. That's not compared. So for them to go from 10-1 to 5-6, that is not a, sound the alarms. Did Travis Reeve forget how to coach? It's
right.
No.
Right.
Obviously, he's a good coach, but combined, I think that you have a situation where, A, taking over a new program is always hard. Taking over a new program in the middle of a global pandemic is double hard, and that may be a situation. The same thing goes at Pflugerville-Weiss. Pflugerville-Weiss, if you remember, was one of the breakout teams of 2020, or 2019, rather. They went 9-3. They were like, wow, what's going on? They hired Steve Van Meter. Steve Van Meter was a really good coach at Hutto. He's got a great pedigree there. They go from 9-3 to 2-4. I think you could just look at those two records and be like, okay, well, something was up if you only played 6 games. But there was also going to be, I think they were losing their first ever senior class, stuff like that. Like, there was always going to be that transition. I'm not worried about knowing whether or not Steve Van Meter can coach.
Exactly.
I know he can. So that's another thing kind of to keep in mind here. So overall, I was a little bit surprised at how well the first-year coaches did.
Yep.
I assumed that I was going to dig into this, and it was going to be like, there were 6 coaches out of the 161 who, like, their teams got better, and every other team got worse.
Right.
But instead, on average, they did take a small step back, but it was only a small step back.
And it's funny, too, because this is way inside baseball, but it would be interesting to look at those teams, too, and go back to our original theory of teams that already had, like, a pretty established offense or defense, especially on the defensive side of the ball, did better in 2020 because, or teams that ran more. I'd be interested to look at that too.
Right, absolutely. And so I want to carry this over, and I want to do this again in 2021 and see how the first-year coaches fare. Again, my projection here on April 6th, 2021, My guess is that it'll be about the same, although maybe a little bit better. But like this idea that having a new coach in the having a first-year coach in 2020 in the middle of a global pandemic is just going to be a disaster. That just wasn't true.
Yeah.
It just didn't bear out that way, which I found was particularly interesting.
One other thing real fast, just to be able to compare. Step said we've already had 155 coaching changes this offseason.
It's April 6th. And
yeah.
Generally speaking, we'll probably have about
April starts to slow down.
Step can correct me. We'll probably have 2 more weeks of coaching changes that are still kind of cooking along.
Kind of step
but
bumps.
Then they're going to really fade away. So, yeah, I mean, in a non-realignment season year, we've already had almost as many 11-man UIL coaching changes than we did in all of 2020. That, I think, is pretty telling. So, anyway, I'm going to have this piece up on TexasFootball.com about how first-year coaches did in 2020.